Title of my lesson today is It's About Time. And it's not only because the lesson is about time, but it is about time to do something for all of us, for me included. Every day there is a question we can ask ourselves: what are we using the time that God has given us on earth? And that there is a time for everything, as we've just read. Firstly, God Himself is timeless and is unchanging. God says that of Himself. If I read in Revelations 1 from verse 7 to 8, and we'll be doing quite a bit of reading today, John writes, "Behold, He is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see Him. Even those who pierced Him, and all tribes of the earth will wail on account of Him. Even so, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God." God says that Himself. "Who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." In the common language of the time, Greek, the alphabet went from Alpha to Omega. And Jesus uses that as a metaphor. God uses that as a metaphor for what He is. Anything you can think of, He's the start and the end and everything in between. There's an interesting story about how the De Beers mining company started marketing diamonds for common use in jewelry many decades ago, where it wasn't the culture of many countries to give a diamond as an engagement or a wedding ring. And they wanted to instill this mindset in more and more countries and cultures. And the slogan that many of you may remember from TV or newspapers of that time is that they started saying, "A diamond is forever." And the symbolic meaning of that was, when you get married, it's meant to be forever. The diamond itself lasts for thousands of years, and it signifies something that is forever. You will never sell a diamond again, because if it's forever, you're supposed to keep it forever. And that solves the demand-supply problem, because the Beers always had too many diamonds. They had to stash them away to keep the price high. But if everybody hoards their diamonds, then hopefully the demand stays high and they can sell more diamonds at a higher price. And that's a worldly example of the value of something that lasts forever. But God is the ultimate example of something that never changes and that is timeless, before the world was created and long after it would end. We sing a song sometimes with the youth that the title is, "I will enter His gates with thanksgiving in my heart." And this is taken from Psalm 100 that says, "Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before Him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is He who made us, and we are His. We are His people, the sheep of His pasture. Enter His gates with thanksgiving and His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him and praise His name. For the Lord is good, and His love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations." And the two key words here is God's love and His faithfulness. There's many references in the Psalms and elsewhere about the trust that we can have in God's love and His faithfulness that is unchanging for all of us and for all humankind forever. And that is a source of trustworthiness for me, that if that's the nature, that's the character of the God that we serve, it's something that I can rely on, it's something that I can trust in. Secondly, God isn't only timeless Himself, but He made us as timeless beings. Our souls will never cease to exist, and He did things to help us to realize that, even here on earth, which seems so temporary. In Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11, that follows from the reading that there's time for everything, it says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. If God sets eternity in my heart, there's an understanding that something is not just going to start and end with my birth and my death. We can look at many cultures all over the earth, over many different decennia, and we can see that there's a common understanding, even if they've never read the Bible, that there is something after death, that life just doesn't, or the existence of a soul doesn't stop when the body dies. Something continues. And I believe that is an understanding that God has put into every human heart, as we've just read in Ecclesiastes. Verse 14 of the same chapter continues and says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him, and many translations also, if you look at the Hebrew for that word, fear being stand in awe of him. Since our God is timeless, and since he helps us to realize that our souls are timeless, it helps us to see who he is and just get a glimpse of how much awe we can have for our God. Thirdly, God created time, and he created us and the time that he gives us. When Paul spoke to the people in Athens to try and explain to them who this God is that he serves, he says the following in Acts 17. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, as people were used to in those days. They made temples and they thought their gods lived there. And he is not served by human hands as if he needs anything. In those days, anything what's the afgod nou weer? Idol had to get was brought to him by humans. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed time in history and the boundaries of their lands. If we read many passages in the Old Testament, it explains that even the leaders of the world of that time, if you read Daniel and others, it doesn't matter if you were Alexander the Great, Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh, whoever, God decided when your kingdom started and ended, he was in control of all of that. And he allowed history to happen to fulfill the greater purpose that he had with Jesus Christ coming when he did. The same is true for us. There's an appointed time that each one of us are born, and there's an appointed time that each one of us will die. And the next verse to me just so beautifully encompasses what is his purpose. Verse 27 says, God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Think about the character of God, that he allows us to seek him and perhaps find him. He's seeking us all the time. But he allows us to make that free choice to respond to him seeking us all the time and find him. And then he emphasizes that if you don't find him, it's not because of him lacking in seeking. He says that they would seek and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. From his side, he's as close as he can get. And he allows us to reach out for him and find him. This passage teaches me that the time that we have on earth is truly a gift from God. He gives it to us freely so that we have the time to seek him and find him, so that we can recognize that he's the true source of everything we have, including our life and our time. Fourthly, God calls us to serve him with our time. Think about all the sporting events that happens this year and coming up. We've got the Tour de France, Wimbledon, the Soccer World Cup in Qatar later this year. Thankfully, Charles has got all the sound sorted there in Qatar. The T20 cricket coming up in Australia later this year. We've got the Rugby World Cup in France next year. There's a lot of things coming up that will grab our attention and our time. And that's just worldwide sport, never mind everything else. And you got to ask, of all the time that we spend, how much time do we actually truly focus on God? And for example, when you're at work, that is a time that you are also potentially spending on God by the way that we act at work, by the way that we interact with people, the things we say, how we say it, how we live at work. Ephesians 5 verse 15 says, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." And the key here for me is making the most of every opportunity. That sense that it's not going to keep on lasting forever. There are a limited number of opportunities. We will have all have heard the term carpe diem, which is Latin for seize the day or pluck the day, like you would pluck a fruit from a tree. This comes from a poet, Horace, Horace, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'll give you some very fancy Latin today. Horace said, "Carpe diem quam minimum credula postero," which means pluck the day, trusting as little as possible in the next one. And that mindset, he spoke about enjoying life to the fullest. And there's no objection from God that we should enjoy life. But he tells us how he wants us to enjoy it. Today, consumerism, and we live in a very consumerism and materialistic society, has changed this into slogans. Some say, just do it. Some talk about YOLO, you only live once. There's a film called The Bucket List, and so on and so on. Everything is aimed at getting something quickly, getting as much as possible for oneself. It's not about others, it's not about the opportunity to make a difference. Society also encourages us to be busy all the time. Often when you ask somebody, how are you? The response is, busy, busy, busy. And that is in some ways seen as something to be aspired to, something to be proud of, to be busy, busy all the time. If you look at what Ephesians 5 says, it says use every opportunity wisely. Not just use every opportunity, but use it wisely. It's not self-centered. It's not using every opportunity for my enjoyment, my enrichment, but using every opportunity wisely. It also doesn't say use every moment, every second counts. It says use every opportunity because the days are evil and do it wisely. God wants us to understand what his will is for us and how he wants us to use all the opportunities that we get. In Psalms 106, we read, "Praise the Lord, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever," which is it's a repeat of the theme we read at the beginning of this lesson. "Who can proclaim the mighty acts of the Lord or fully declare his praise? Blessed are those who act justly, who always do what is right." Again, in a sense of time, over our lifetime, who always do what is right. Now, I'll be the first one to put up my hand to say, I don't manage that. And I think we can all say that. We don't manage to always do what is right. But God calls us to think about our Christian life in that way. Every time we have the opportunity to choose between a godly reaction to something or an evil reaction to something, that we think about, God has given us this moment to make a choice. What choice am I going to make? In the next point, God also wants us to trust Him all the time. David went through many, many difficult situations. He died a couple of times almost. People hunted him down. He had things really tough. And he himself says to us and everyone that we can trust God all the time. In Psalm 62, he says, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from Him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken. O God, rest my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock, my refuge is God." And the key verse here is trust in Him at all times. O people, pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us. And I think that is a timeless message. All of us can think of aspects in our lives that we think, maybe I should be in control of this because I'm not sure I can trust God with this. And I need to actually make the plan and then just ask God to help me execute the plan. Now, I'll be the first one to say we must plan, we must work, we must work at our problems. But if we think that we are the final person in charge of the outcome, then we're missing our God-called mindset to trust in Him. It's difficult for me in some aspects of my life to trust in Him. And I suspect it's difficult for many of us. And it's something that God calls us again and again to pray about, that we would trust Him more, and to looking back at our lives of how many times He hasn't failed us, to recognize that, well, whatever comes our way in future, He doesn't fail us, and His way is the best way. Lastly, time waits for nobody, and God makes us aware of that in many places. In Romans chapter 13, verse 10, it says, "Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Beside this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light." Salvation is nearer now to us than when we first believed. We all move on. I sometimes get a fright when I see my university friends and school friends, how old they've become. And I think all of us experience something like that, because time just doesn't stand still. And God makes us aware of this in many different ways. For example, that we notice aging in our bodies. He gives us a window to seek Him. He reminds us not to delay. He reminds us that death is a part of life, and that we can seek Him, that we must seek Him while we can. In the film The Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams plays a teacher, John Keating. And the teacher is trying to make the high school kids realize that they won't live forever. Now, I think all of us remember when we were in high school, it felt like you were going to live forever. And I know some adults who feel like they're going to live forever. I think many of us forget that at some point it's going to end in this life before the next life starts. And Robin Williams makes a quote from a book, and he says, gather he rosebuds while he may, old time is still a-flying. For this same flower that blooms today, tomorrow may be dying." I think that quote says it all. Lastly, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul finally, in a very succinct way, reminds us of this time that is finite. He says, "As God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. When you get something in vain, it means you get something really precious, but then it has no effect. You do nothing with it. And God's grace is extended to all of us. What reaction is reasonable to the grace that God extends to all of us? For he says, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. If you're at a point in your life where you realize that you've drifted, that you are not as close to God as you once were, where, as in some of the verses we've read today, he calls us to seek him and that we may find him, that these texts will prick our hearts, all of our hearts, and move us to respond to the grace that God has given to all of us. Thank you.